part 11 of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 tonight. And we're going to continue our study in marriage, singleness, and morality in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is a very interesting chapter. Paul is talking about different peoples in the church. He's talking about the man, the woman, the wife, the husband, the unmarried, the widow, the married, and the virgins. That's at the beginning here. Now, does everybody have these notes?
No, I'm missing part. I'm missing what you're on, please start.
Does everybody have, you should have up to page 43.
No.
If you were here last week, Agath, you would have had that.
43?
No, I gave you that
Yes,
tonight.
Yes.
I just gave it to you.
Okay,
Okay, so now we're on page 37, and we're in verse 5 of 1 Corinthians 7. So Paul is saying, not only must we equally maintain a good mind in our marriages, that is, the husband has to render due benevolence. We looked at that last week, remember? Render is to pay back, due is the debt, benevolence is of good mind, and the husband is to render that to the wife, and the wife to the husband. So there's an equality there. And then he says, equally, the wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. Likewise also, the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. So they must equally surrender yourself to your spouse. So if you say, I don't want to do that, then don't get married. So the husband and the wife surrender the authority, there's the blank letter A, the authority of their own body in marriage. That is the word power there. The wife hath not power of her own body. That is authority, but the husband. Now, what does this require? This requires tremendous trust and respect. If my wife's body is under my authority, I care for my body. I should care for her body. And only what's best for it. So that's always been the standard for me. Is that best for you? If it's my body, I want what's best for my body. So again, it might seem that the man could take tremendous advantage, or one or the other, but usually the man in this kind of situation, because he's physically stronger. And that might seem very fearful, but you're entering into this one flesh relationship where there is to be, he's to love you as Christ loved the church, and you're to submit to him as the church submits to Christ. And there has to be that love and respect. So Wiersbe says, sexual love is a beautiful tool to build with. And where's the blank there? Let's go to our book here. I mean, I have the blank, but it's on page 86. Yeah, you need your book anyway opened up there, because we'll look at it a number of times. The bottom of page 86. I have a few books right on the back there if you need one. What does he say? Third line from the bottom on page 86. Sexual love is a beautiful tool to build with, not a what?
Weapon.
A weapon. And many use it as a weapon to fight with. Now, there is, I hear, this is constantly in the news now with all of these abuse scandals, but so much is in the news as well about non-consensual sexual relationships, right? And even today I heard, that there was somebody accused of abusing someone, and he said no, but he argues back, no, we did it consensually, right? And and this is why women often do not, and are often very afraid, up until even recently, till the whole Weinstein thing blew up. Now women are in this environment where they feel more liberty, and where people will actually believe them and listen to them, so they're coming forward. But most times women have not traditionally. How come? Because it goes, it's a very intimate thing going on there, and it's he said versus she said. So a lot of times women just stay quiet. But think about this, and I said this to my wife. I said, you know, everybody's arguing about consensual relation, intimate, in the intimacy aspect. There's only one way to guarantee consent. That's right. That is when you're married. When you say, I do, when my wife said, I do, guess what she was giving to me? Consent. And when I said I do, I was giving her consent.
Well, not really. Because a woman could still say no, and a man could still say no. Well, biblically, you shouldn't, but there's instances where you could be uncomfortable.
But you know what I'm saying, though, Anna? I'm saying that that intimate relationship is reserved for the marriage. And when two people get married, they know that's part of the package. That's what I'm saying. And I'm saying that to say to you, and to any single person out there, is stay away from this sexual intimacy unless you say I do, because that's really when you give consent, and and it's just a mess today because people are it's like the sexual revolution of the 60s has just really all of the wickedness and perversion of it is just now it's coming out really how terrible it is. Anyway, he says here, do not withhold yourself from your spouse except through mutual agreement, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer. Otherwise, that would be defrauding. It says to defraud. Defraud ye not one the other. So when either a husband or a wife hold their body back from their spouse, they're defraud. What is fraud? Like tax fraud, let's say, or some kind of fraud, is when you hold back something that you should have paid. So he says, defraud ye not. Don't hold back what you should render, except to be for consent. And by the way, I think it's really interesting he mentions fasting and prayer in the context of a husband-wife relationship. And I believe that if a husband and wife are having real difficult problems, and I say this by way of counseling, if you're ever talked to someone who's having marital problems, you might even ask them, have you fasted and prayed together over that issue? I believe that is a way to deal with marriage problems. This kind, Jesus said, does not come forth but by fasting and prayer. Fasting and prayer is a weapon in our arsenal to deal with the biggest problems that we have, the biggest mountains that we have to climb. So I put that there. Prayer and fasting can be an important practice to overcome marriage problems. Satan can tempt married partners if they do not have normal physical relations. He says, let Satan tempt you for your, that's a word sometimes we probably don't know what sometimes these words mean, incontinency, which simply means your lack of self-control. In other words, if a husband and wife do not have normal relationship with each other, where are they going to start looking? Where are they be tempted maybe to start looking? Outside of the marriage. So you don't want that when you're married, obviously. Okay, so that's that part about the physical intimacy between husband and wife is not only proper, but an obligation, verses 3 through 5. Then we see number 3 here, being single is a gift of God. And that's verse 7. Being single is a gift of God. He said, I would that all men were even as I myself. Paul's talking as a married man or a single man? Single. As a single man. So Paul's saying, if you were single, is that good or bad? Good. That's good. He says, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. Okay, on the next page, 38. Some specific situations now from verse 8 to the end of the chapter. Specific situations. First of all, with the unmarried and widows. And basically what he says here is remaining single is good and sometimes preferable. That's verse 8. He said, it is good for them to abide even as I say to the unmarried and widows.
So, Pastor, I have a question. Can I ask a
Yeah.
question?
Mhm.
So, when it says here, I've never really read 1 Corinthians, but verse 8. But when you say remaining single, is that of your choosing to remain single? Is that what it means?
Mhm.
That you choose to remain single?
Well, some people might not choose to remain single, but yet they do choose to remain single. Because if you really wanted to get married, you could have gotten married probably. Somebody would have married you, but you chose to remain single. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
I mean,
You mean like lower?
See this?
yeah, that's what I'm
Say
saying.
that one more time.
If you
Lowered your
lower
standard of
standards,
some kind?
Like, you know, if you're willing to marry a non-believer, and technically we could,
Yeah.
but not as
I agree with that, Pastor.
Well, okay. Well, maybe maybe it's not a ironclad, rule, but I know many single people who could have gotten married if they had chosen to get married, but they didn't feel it was in God's will
Yeah.
or it was for them to get married. But that doesn't mean they couldn't have done it. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but so it's not something that you choose, right? Because you know if it's not God's will, you choose to follow God's will, but I did not choose to be single just because I'm following God's will. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right?
But he says, like in verse 9, but if they cannot contain, let them marry. Well, what if you're, probably there's some single people, though, who are like maybe really burning to get married, but they haven't found the right person. So now they have to live in a situation that could be a bit uncomfortable for them at the same time.
Right. So
I think it's yes and no to some extent. In other words, do people choose to stay single? Yes. And do they choose to get married? Yes. But as Christians, it's not a matter of, just what I want, right? And that's what I think you're saying. You want God's will. And that's what he actually says. If you go to the very last verse of this chapter, he says, but she is happier if she so abide. And really a theme in this chapter for Paul, and he's talking here about a widow, somebody who had a husband who died. And he's saying she'll be happier if she stays single. So a theme of this chapter really is if you're single, there are some real benefits to a single life. I think that's a theme of 1 Corinthians 7. But he says, and I think, I'm sorry, it's the verse before that, the verse before that, verse 39. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. And I believe in the Lord means that if she's going to remarry, she has to marry who? A Christian, but she also has to marry in the will of God, in the Lord. So I think those two things.
So you don't choose to remain single.
But
No, 'cause
you
I
choose
actually-
all kinds of things in life.
Because I'm only thinking, I actually wanted to go back from last week about the term marriageable, right? Because it's, I don't know how to say this, but it's not about like giving birth or stuff, but I'm just wondering, can you make yourself marriageable? Like to come on, Chrissy, help me out. We talked about this. Right? That you're equipped to be married. Can you make yourself that up? You know what I mean?
I think so.
Like now I'm
So-
single, but I want to get married, so I would like to make myself marriageable. Not just like childbearing or any, not like
Right.
that. But you know what I mean?
I think so, yes. You have to put yourself into
This
the
is
proper frame of mind. You have to prepare yourself emotionally, physically, spiritually to prepare yourself for marriage, definitely, because it's a huge decision. It's a huge decision that requires grace beyond our natural ability. That's why I believe marriage, we need the power of the Holy Spirit to stay married and to fulfill our responsibilities as husbands and wives. So yeah, there's things we can do to prepare.
Well, you could prepare, right? But if the right man or the right woman does not come, I was listening to a very old preacher, Bob T, and he was saying that there is a right man for a right woman. And even in the Christian field, you get people like, I'll give us things quickly about my pastor. He started dating a young woman, but that young woman was not his peer, if I should use that word. Sooner or later, they got divorced because the people in the
The
church
pastor got divorced?
Of course.
Well, he shouldn't be a pastor. I hope he stepped down.
Oh, well, you need to hear my story.
Okay.
I'll tell you later.
That sounds like a long story.
As you said, the preparation for marriage. But if that right person does not come along,
Yeah.
you, as you said, spiritually, you just can't go hang up with anybody because it's life on earth and hell on earth if you do that.
Yeah.
That's why we have so much Christian divorces.
No, you know why we don't have Christian divorces? Because people are not fulfilling their responsibilities.
Right.
Check this one out. Think about it. In Paul's day, people didn't decide whether they were going to get married, really, when you come down. It was Paul later on, it's the father's responsibility. Fathers were taking the dominant position of giving their daughters to marry. And in many cultures, I'm getting way ahead of myself now, but in many cultures, people didn't make those decisions. The parents made those decisions. Our whole system of dating and marriage today is actually foreign to so many cultures throughout human history. And it's very interesting that we have very high divorce rates. Now, I'm not saying that arranged marriages, they probably had their problems too, who knows,
They do.
But yeah, they do. But it's also true that arranged marriages through history have worked. That's why people have done it. I mean, here's Isaac, and the servant brings back Rebecca. He seemed pretty happy. I mean, they hit it off okay. And on and on we could go, even in Bible days. Yeah.
Going back to that, if you can choose singleness, like I'm thinking the way Paul is saying it, like I guess many single people want to get married and are ready to get married, but I guess seeing it from a man's perspective, he's saying that a man can choose singleness if he wants to follow Christ. Like he could be more focused on God's ministry if he's single than if he's not, because then he has to refocus on the affairs of the home.
Right. But he says it for both, the man and the woman, too.
But then
He says it
also
for
going
both.
back to the offices, like can a man choose singleness and also be a pastor? Like I guess it only if he said if I was to marry, I would be the husband of one wife, but he doesn't want to get married.
Paul chose singleness, and he was an apostle.
But can he be a pastor? Like
I wouldn't see why not. If he could be an apostle, how could he not be a pastor?
but nowadays church offices, a single man can do it then. As
Yeah.
long as he says if I was to get
I
married,
think
I
so.
would be the husband of one
Right.
wife.
I believe that I believe that a man can be single and be a pastor. I do believe that. But I also believe it's a local church decision whether they want a single man as a pastor. If a church says no, we want our pastor to be married, which most churches will want, it's a local church decision too. So, I see both of those things.
Then also single women, there could be a group of single women that want to get married and another group of single women that don't want to get married. And that's good. Is that good or that's not good?
It's fine.
That's fine.
Yeah. I think what Paul's saying here is if you want to get married and you get married in the Lord, get married. If you want to stay single in the Lord, stay single. Let's work through this a little bit because he deals with all these things actually. Okay, so Number 2 is burn with lust. If they burn with lust, they should marry. The word literally burn is to be on fire. Get married and don't fornicate. And I tell guys, some guys, I don't want to get married. And they commit fornication every other month. I'm like, what are you doing? Stop that. You know?
So but I feel like it. I'm sorry, Pastor, but like it.
I can't get very far here on this class here tonight. No. Okay, that's okay.
Right? But for women who like who wanted to get married, right? But wanted to follow God's will. So it's really not, can I just say me? Like my choosing to stay, because if I talk to a third person, I'll just confuse everyone. So I'll just, right, like put myself like not to get married, although I wanted to get married, but I'm not really choosing to be single. My choosing to be
right.
single.
You would like to find the right person to get married.
Right, but I wanted to do God's will at the same time.
Right.
So in this verse, we're trying to say, like, if you can control, then just go marry. Like,
Right.
How do I
Balance that.
Yeah.
In the Lord.
Yes.
That's where you have to just believe, though, that, okay, you would like to get married, but you are choosing to be single because you're not getting married. You could probably get married to somebody if you really wanted to, but you're not choosing that because you know that's going to create more problems for you than singleness. And you're right. Because it's only best to get married in the Lord with a believer in the will of God. So then, okay, as far as the burning goes, marriage is not even a foolproof solution to the burning. Do married people commit adultery? Okay, so they were burning in their marriage because whatever you have, that can become commonplace. Whether it's a new dress, a new car, or a new spouse, you know, you have to learn to love what you have in your spouse. So what I'm saying is the burning is, I believe that, what do I believe? That we should ask God to give us contentment from that burning, whether we're single or married. That's what I believe. But I think what he's saying with the burning here, though, is if somebody does have that burn, it means it's not, singleness isn't their gift. Because he is saying one has a gift. It seems that singleness is almost a gift.
It is.
Now, does that mean that if you're single, let's say you're single, does that mean that that's your gift? Not necessarily. I don't know. You know? So, okay, let's just try to go through this. See if I get it. Christians married to other Christians. Okay, verse 10. In verse 10, there was an express command given by Jesus. Now, look at what he says. Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So here, what he's saying, and he's going to say this a number of times in this chapter. Sometimes he'll just say, this is kind of like my word. But here he's saying, this, I don't say this, the Lord. So in verse 10, he's saying there is an express command given by Jesus. Verse 10. Unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Now look at verse 12. He says, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. Now, some people say, oh, that's not the word of God. That's just Paul's opinion. No, that's not. He's saying here, he did not have a definite word. That's the blank there in number 1. In verse 12, there was no definite word given by Jesus to Paul, but Paul is giving his apostolic word. So what Paul has written is the word of God. So I wanted to say that because we're going to deal with that a number of times. So in verse 10, if separation occurs, what is Paul's counsel to the married couple in verse 10? in verse 11. If she departs, let her remain what?
Unmarried.
Unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. So that's the general principle. So this is when Christians are married to other Christians. If a separation occurs, remain unmarried or be reconciled. Be content. That's another theme of this chapter. Single, married, unmarried, virgin, husband, wife. Be content. That's the state of least population right there, contentment. Now, there might be times of separation and not divorce. And letter A, I put physical abuse. Obviously, if a woman is being physically abused and is not safe in her home, I would counsel her to separate from that situation immediately. If there's drug use, or if there's sexual immorality, if one of the spouses is living in an adulterous type situation and wants to come home and have, let's say the man's in adultery and he wants to have his wife and his adulteress, at that point, I would counsel separation until there's repentance. So I would counsel separation in those situations. Then he gives counsel now to unbelievers, Christians, okay, letter C, Christians married to unbelievers. That's the blank. Christians married to unbelievers. And the,
What is number 2, Pastor? A number 2.
Reconcile.
No, the unmarried and widows.
burn with lust. Burn with lust. That was under A, unmarried and widows. If they burn with lust, they should marry. That one? Yeah. Okay, so let's look at verse 12 through 16. He says, but to the rest speak I not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. Now, why would he think about putting her away? Just because she's not a Christian. The woman which hath a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Why would she even consider leaving him just because he's not a Christian? Paul then says, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. The unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, now they are holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So this passage is very controversial. The big question here is desertion itself a ground for divorce? Now, I would say no myself as I work through this. I don't believe that desertion, the desertion of one of the couple, one of the spouses, is a ground in itself for divorce. I'll just be right up front with you. I believe there is a ground for divorce and remarriage, and it's fornication or adultery in the marriage. That's my understanding. There's so many different views on marriage, a divorce and remarriage. Some say no divorce, no remarriage. Some say that there's a ground for adultery, which is my position. Some would say add certain other things. They would say adultery, desertion, or other things. But I just keep it right to that one point. Okay, so let's look at this though. So Paul's first of all saying that these words, he's not saying these words are not inspired. Okay, these are the inspired words of God. But he is saying that the Lord himself did not speak directly to these issues, as I just said a little bit before. Paul did not have a specific quote from Jesus on this point. Now, some unbelievers want to remain in their marriage with a believer. They want him to stay. The believer is not to put away, or, verse 13, what's the word? To depart. Let her not leave him. She is not to depart from the unbeliever. So the believer is, the husband is not to put away the unbelieving wife. The Christian woman is not to depart from the unbelieving husband. He says that the unbelieving spouse is And he uses an interesting word in verse 14. He says, the unbeliever, both the unbelieving husband or the unbelieving wife, is what? Is sanctified. That word means set apart. It doesn't mean they're saved, but it does mean they've been set apart
To each other.
in a blessed circumstance to hear the gospel, is how I put it in our notes. So Wiersbe says, an unsaved partner is not saved because of a believing mate, but that, this is on page 88, down in the middle of the page, the middle paragraph. He says the Christian partner could have a spiritual influence on the unsaved mate. 1 Corinthians 7:14 does not teach that the unsaved partner is saved because of the believing mate, since each partner must individually decide for Christ. Rather, it means that the believer exerts a what? Spiritual influence. That's the blank. A believer exerts a spiritual influence in the home that can lead to the salvation of the lost partner. So that's what I believe the idea of sanctified is. Not that they're saved, not that the children are saved or the unsaved person is saved living with the believer, but they've been given a blessing, right? To live with a believer, to hear the gospel. So that's the idea there. They've been set apart in that sense. Now, so here's two people, they get married back in the 1st century, and one becomes a Christian, and the other is now unsaved. The believer thinks, oh, I'm going to have to leave this marriage. Why would they think that? Could they get it from the Bible anywhere? Yeah. They could perhaps get it from the days, letter D, the days of, we talked about this in church a few weeks ago, Ezra. Remember, in the days of Ezra, they did a mass divorce when the believers married unbelievers in great number, and it threatened the Jewish community coming out of exile. Ezra, forced a massive divorce. And so maybe they were thinking of that mass divorce of unbelieving spouses. But that was just a very unusual situation and circumstance, and obviously it's not to be repeated. But now the question, though, is what happens when an unbeliever does depart? So, letter A, when the unbeliever initiates the separation and the divorce, let them go and be at peace. B, the response of the believer can lead to the salvation of the unsaved partner. That's what I believe he's saying here. If the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. God hath called us to peace. The response of the believer can lead to the salvation. What knowest thou, whether thou shalt save thy husband? So I believe that as Christians, we should be demonstrating peace and contentment. And let the unsaved people see that contentment and let that draw them to Christ. So let's say there's a man and he's unbeliever. He says, I don't want to live with you and I'm putting you away from me. I'm going to divorce you. He initiates it. He initiates that divorce, puts her away. She can't become all, lose her mind and become overly clingy and say, no, and there's a word I'm looking for, I can't find it, but what's the word I'm trying to think?
Hysterical.
Okay, hysterical, okay, yeah. She has to be at peace. Somehow you have to trust God in that situation. I think that's what he's saying. If they depart, let them depart. God hath called us to peace. So clinging to a marriage in which the unbeliever wants out would lead to continuous conflict and frustration. The unbeliever should see peace in the believer's actions. Let me just finish this and then you can ask questions. Letter D, the implication is that the unbeliever leaves in order to have someone else. Therefore, when fornication or adultery occurs, the believer has biblical grounds for divorce and remarriage. Under the law, adultery terminated the marriage as the guilty partner was stoned. And this is a major reason why I believe that adultery is a ground for divorce. In the Old Testament, what did they do to the adulterer? They stoned him. That would end the marriage. Death definitely ends the marriage. So adultery is like the death act of a marriage. That doesn't mean there can't still be forgiveness and reconciliation. I would still always counsel that. But if there's that continuous, let's say there's a continuous sin of adultery and unrepentance, I think that even at that point, the believer can initiate the divorce. Other than that, I don't believe that a believer should ever initiate a divorce. If the unbeliever initiates the divorce on the believer, and let's just say in this situation, like he's like, I don't want to be married to you, and so he initiates a divorce against his wife. He's the unbeliever, she's the believer, and then he leaves her. Now, usually, why is he going to leave her? Is he going to stay single?
No.
I would say, like, probably 99% of the time, he's going to leave her and get somebody else. So at that point, she could say, there's fornication, there's adultery in the marriage. And that was his, and then he divorced her. I think she's free in that situation. That's my understanding of it.
Pastor Roth's letter C, clinging to marriage is a rich unbeliever walks out would lead to continual
Conflict.
Thank you.
Conflict and frustration. And the last blank here is, of course, forgiveness and reconciliation is always preferable to divorce. Okay. You know, this is a funny passage because people will take it like when it says, if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage. Now, what's the bondage there? Is it the marriage bond itself? God hath called us to peace, not under bondage. I do believe that he's talking about the marriage bond, because marriage is a form of bondage. It is a choice that you enter into, but it's a union, two becoming one. That's a very tight bond. And you know, it's a terrible thing when that bond is broken, for sure. And God hates divorce. So okay, do you have any questions about that?
So, Pastor, these verses, Christians married to unbelievers, right? About the blessing things set apart. That's only if, is this referring to couples that, you know, were not Christians, both non-Christians when they entered into the marriage, or is it?
It doesn't clearly say that. It doesn't clearly say that they both weren't Christians, but when you're saying for an unbeliever married to a believer, that's your question? Were they both unbelievers when they entered into the marriage? Yeah. It doesn't clearly say that, but I think there is an implication of that is what was happening, especially in the first century when they were first hearing the gospel. Just think that, you know, that there were, you know, all these pagan people that were married, and then they were hearing the gospel, and maybe one was being saved and the other spouse wasn't. So I think there is an implication that is what was happening, but that's not always what happens. You know, sometimes a Christian will marry a non-believer, and at first they'll think we can make a go of this. But then after time, you know, different people change in the marriage, right? People change. And maybe the believing spouse becomes stronger spiritually, and things that weren't so important at the beginning of their marriage are more important now for me to do for Jesus, and that I don't want to live with that, you know? So I think it could be different situations.
Pastor, can you explain again verse 12, what he meant by not the Lord, but I? Can you explain it again?
Okay, so verse 12, when he says, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. And I think he says, look at verse 25. He says a similar thing. He says a kind of a similar thing through this. Verse 25, he says, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. So I think that's what he's saying. There was not a direct statement of Jesus on this particular thing. But he says, Yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. So as an inspired apostle, he is then giving his judgment on that.
Why do you think he has the need to clarify that was not that was not clearly like what? There's so many different versions in his letters that could go either way. Why in there does he feel like he has to?
Yeah, that's the question is, why in this instance does Paul say, I don't have a direct statement of the Lord? Perhaps because, first of all, marriage is such a important relationship. It is such at times a difficult relationship. It is under siege throughout history and in every culture. I believe the devil hates marriage. He always tries to create confusion and disruption, division, divorce, and so forth. And Jesus did speak specifically on the matter of divorce. So, and plus, in one commentary I was reading is that sometimes people would make up statements that Jesus supposedly said. But so Paul's honestly saying, I don't have a direct statement. I'm not going to pretend like I do, like I have some inside knowledge of Jesus that you don't have. So Paul is actually being honest, saying, I don't have any, specific statement, and I don't have the inside scoop, on what Jesus said here, but this is my position on it.
But then this is written in the Word of God and it's inspired. Right. So then, well, you still have to follow this, right? You can't say that because Paul does not have a direct, word from God, then, I can put her away. Because clearly it says here, do not put her away. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, so you're saying, why would Paul say that? Because he's an inspired apostle and what he says goes anyway. He doesn't need, you're saying he doesn't really need a direct statement from Jesus because he's an inspired writer. He's writing the Word of God.
Yeah.
So why would he even have to say that? You know why? Because maybe some of the Corinthians didn't trust him. They even doubted his apostleship. And I believe saying that might give them a sense of confidence in what he's saying and that he's being honest with them in how he's communicating. Maybe. Okay, what time do you have? Is that the right time? Is it like 2 minutes till? Is it just
8:48?
Okay, let me do this real fast. Go. Verse 17 through 24. He almost like breaks. He's been talking about marriage and singleness and divorce and these things. And now he's talking about social issues. Very interesting. He's like, why does he switch? Because he's talking really about contentment. And whether you're married or whether you're a slave or whether you're single, or whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised, be content. And so that's why letter D is living in contentment. So Paul leaves the question of marriage for a moment to say that whether one is free or slave, circumcised or uncircumcised, one must be content. The issue of marriage, he seems to kind of like be putting it on a shelf, but I think marriage can still be applied to what he's saying. Because if you're single, be content. If you're married, be content. Unmarried, divorced, or virgin, be content. So in the circumstances which God has saved you, Paul says in verse 17, so walk. So let him walk. This relates to social standing, occupation, where you're living, marital status, religious markings, tattoos. In other words, let me put it this way. What if you get saved and your body's full of tattoos? Do you have to run to the tattoo shop and get them all taken off you? No. God saved you with all those tattoos. Just think of that. It's not like you had to get those tattoos removed before he saved you. He saved you with all those tattoos. Now, after you're saved, I don't think you should be going out and getting more. Uh-oh. A lot of people disagree with me on that one. But so walk. So where you're living, maybe you're living in the project. God saved you in the project. You could be content there. It's okay. God saved you there. It's okay you live there for now. Maybe he'll move you from there. But until then, be content there. So in this circumstance, so what? Serve God where he's called you unless he calls you elsewhere. Now, if one is a prostitute, or if somebody is in the mafia shaking people down, they need to get out of their job, okay? If it's inherently evil or immoral, get out of it. But Paul is not forbidding one from bettering himself in this. He is encouraging contentment in life circumstances. One must never think they have to wait to be content or complete, because Christ provides that now. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'll stop right there. But here's the question, and you could think about this in light of that passage. What is the church's role in promoting social, economic, or political change? That's an interesting question. We can kind of start right there. Next week, have a good evening.